The wind over the Arizona plains carried a faint cry that made Luke Carson pull his horse to a stop. It was late afternoon, the sun low and copper red, and he was on his way back to his ranch after driving cattle for a neighboring outfit. He had almost ignored the sound, thinking it was a coyote or the wind itself, but then it came again, small, desperate, unmistakably human. Luke swung out of the saddle, boots sinking into the dust, eyes narrowing toward the cluster of mesquite bushes near the dry creek bed. The cry came once more, softer this time, and when he parted the branches, he saw her, a tiny girl, no older than 6, wrapped in a tattered blanket, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She flinched when he crouched down, her eyes wide, dark as the desert night, but Luke held up his hand slowly. "Easy, little one," he said softly. "Ain't gonna hurt you." She said something in Apache. He didn't understand the words, but he understood fear when he saw it. Her ankle was scraped raw, her lip bleeding. He glanced around, saw no sign of anyone else, no horses, no tracks except her small bare feet. Whoever she'd been with was gone, and by the look of her, she'd been running for a while. Luke hesitated. The reservation was more than 2 days away, and the army patrols didn't take kindly to cowboys meddling in Apache affairs. But he couldn't just ride off and leave her. With a sigh, he lifted her gently into his arms. She stiffened but didn't fight, just looked at him with eyes too old for her face. "We'll get you warm, little miss," he murmured, mounting up with her in his arms. "Then we'll figure out what in blazes happened to you." By the time he reached his ranch, the desert was blue with dusk. His old sheepdog barked once, tail wagging, then fell quiet when Luke dismounted and carried the child inside. The cabin smelled of smoke and leather, a small fire crackled in the hearth. Luke set her down near the warmth and handed her a tin cup of water. She drank greedily, coughing once, then stared at him like she didn't trust that any of this was real. "You got a name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered something that sounded like, "Nita." "Nita," he repeated, nodding. "All right, Nita, you're safe now." Over the next few days, the girl hardly spoke but began to move with quiet familiarity around the place, feeding the hens, watching him mend fences, sleeping curled up under a quilt near the fire. Luke couldn't help but notice the way she seemed to listen for something in the wind, as if waiting for footsteps that never came. He figured she'd lost her family, maybe in one of those bloody clashes the newspapers whispered about but no one liked to talk through. Then one morning, as Luke was checking the water trough, he spotted smoke on the horizon, not a campfire, but a signal column. Apache smoke. His heart quickened. He saddled his horse and rode toward it, careful to approach slow, hands open. Near a cluster of rocks, a woman stood beside a painted pony, tall and proud, her hair braided and streaked with ash from travel. Her eyes were fierce until they saw the child's small blanket draped over Luke's saddle. Then something in her face broke. She took one step forward and whispered, "Nita." Luke turned slightly, pointing toward the direction of his ranch. "She's safe," he said quietly. "Been with me 3 days." I didn't know who she belonged to. The woman's shoulders trembled, but she stood straight, her chin lifting. "I am Tala," she said, her English careful, low. "Nita is my daughter." Luke removed his hat. "Then I reckon you'll want to come with me." They rode back together under the wide sky, the child's name heavy in the silence between them. When they reached the cabin, Nita ran from the doorway. With a cry, leaping into her mother's arms. Luke looked away, feeling an ache he couldn't quite name. It was a reunion he had no part in, but it filled the small house with warmth he hadn't felt in years. Later, as night fell and the wind whispered through the grass, Tala sat by the fire while Nita slept. She spoke softly, telling Luke of her husband, a hunter killed months ago in a raid gone wrong, and of how Nita had fled in the chaos, vanishing into the desert. Her eyes were tired, her face lined with dust and grief, but her voice carried a quiet strength. "You saved her," she said finally, looking at Luke. "For that, you have my thanks." Luke shifted uneasily, poking at the fire. "Didn't do much, just found her." Tala's lips curved slightly. "You found more than you think." For a long moment, neither spoke. The night outside was vast and full of unseen things, but inside the cabin, there was peace. Luke felt it, fragile, like dawn over the desert. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether Tala and Nita would stay, or ride away with the sunrise, but for the first time in years, the loneliness he carried felt a little lighter. Days passed, and the air around the ranch began to change. Luke had grown used to the sound of boots on his porch and the low creak of the rocking chair at night, but now there were softer sounds, the rustle of Tala's braids as she moved around the fire, the gentle murmur of her voice as she sang Nita to sleep in Apache. It was strange, peaceful, and something in Luke's chest loosened every time he heard it. The widow didn't ask for help, but she worked as if she had always belonged there. She fixed the torn fence wire, ground maize in a stone bowl she carried with her, and tended to the horses with a care that even Luke respected. He had known proud women before, but none quite like her. She spoke little, her eyes always watching, always measuring. Sometimes he caught her gazing westward at sunset, where the mountains turned the color of blood. He wondered if she thought about her husband there, or about the tribe that had turned its back on her after his death. One morning, Luke rode into town for supplies. The air was tense as soon as he hit the main street. Folks on porches stopped talking when they saw him, their eyes following the trail dust on his coat. Old Hank, the blacksmith, spat in the dirt. "Heard you got company up at your place," he said, not quite friendly. "Not the kind decent folks keep, neither." Luke's jaw tightened. "You heard wrong," he said simply, stepping past him toward the store. But whispers followed, cowboys muttering under their breath, women pulling their children aside. He ignored them, bought what he needed, and rode out before the anger boiling in his gut could boil over. When he reached the ranch, Tala was waiting at the gate, her hand on Nita's shoulder. "You went to town," she said quietly. "They will not like that I am here." Luke dismounted, setting the sack of flour on the porch. "They'll get used to it." She shook her head slowly. "White men don't get used to what they fear." That night, they ate in silence. The fire flickered low, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. Nita had fallen asleep with her doll beside her, and the rancher and the widow sat facing the embers. "You could go," Luke said finally. "Head back to your people." Tala's gaze was steady, her voice calm. "My people buried me when they buried my husband. The white men hate me. The Apache distrust me. Only Nita keeps me alive." Luke looked at her across the firelight. "Then maybe stay. This land don't ask where you come from. Only what you're willing to give." For the first time, she smiled, not wide, but enough to soften the edges of her face. "And what do you give, Luke?" "Carson," he hesitated, eyes dropping to his calloused hands. "Everything I've got," he said. The following days were quiet again, though not empty. Tala began helping with the cattle drives. Nita chased the chickens around the yard, laughing in a way she hadn't before. Luke found himself looking forward to the evenings, the shared bread, the sound of her voice in the dark. But peace, in the frontier, never lasted long. One evening, as the sun dipped low, a group of riders appeared over the ridge, 5 men, dust-covered, carrying rifles. Luke saw them coming and knew before they even reached the fence line that they weren't friendly. The leader, a man named Briggs, spat out a wad of tobacco and glared down from his saddle. "We heard you're keeping company with an Apache," he said, his voice like gravel. "That true?" Luke stood tall beside the gate. "That's none of your business." Briggs' smirk twisted. "It's everyone's business when a rancher brings trouble to town. We don't take kindly to that kind around here." Tala stepped out from the cabin then, Nita clinging to her leg. She said nothing, only stood straight, her face calm but eyes sharp as flint. Briggs chuckled darkly. "Well, look at that. She's got some fire, don't she? Maybe we should." Luke's voice cut through like a whip. "You best ride on, Briggs." Briggs' grin faltered. He spat again, turned his horse, and left with the others, the sound of their laughter fading down the trail. But the air around the ranch felt different now, heavier, like a storm waiting to break. That night, Luke couldn't sleep. He stood at the window, watching the dark horizon. He could feel Tala's presence behind him before she spoke. "They will come again," she said softly. "I know. They hate what they do not understand." He turned to her. "And what do they not understand?" Her eyes met his. "That we are the same." For a long moment, the silence stretched. The wind brushed through the open window, carrying the scent of sage and rain. Luke nodded slowly. "Then we'll make him see it." In that quiet promise, something changed, not spoken, not needed. The ranch wasn't just his anymore. It had become something else. A place of defiance. A home forged out of loneliness, loss, and stubborn hope. Outside, lightning flickered far away, silent and distant. But in the cabin, the fire burned steady, casting light over 2 faces that had spent too long in shadow.